Okay, well, welcome to the third lecture that is part of the History of Israel, Part 1. The third lecture being on the founding of the State of Israel. Now, our first lecture this week set the context of the global political breakup of the Ottoman Empire and the move of nation states that set the context and made it possible for the modern state of Israel to even be born. And then we talked about the other consequence of that breakup being the Islamic movement of jihad and how that creates a context for opposition to Israel. It's all a part of going back to the Ottoman Empire. Now, we talked about the first two items on this list. So now in this third lecture, we're going to deal with the rest of the items: Israel's independence, her two major wars, and then the peace agreements that we have going on in modern day. So here, once again, I always like to review, set the context. This is the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, where the Christian and infidels came into the Middle East, took over these lands, set up modern nation states that we have throughout the Middle East today, not just Israel, but all of them were created out of this political process. A part of this process was that the British were given, you see here, Egypt, Palestine, and into what today is Iraq. They were given all that territory, and they needed to set up self-rule for future. So this is the map of Palestine that was given to the British under mandate. And you see it's quite large. Here, my red arrow always points to about where Jerusalem would be. This is the land of Israel today. This is the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, and the Dead Sea. And but the British owed favors to the Arabs who had helped them defeat the Ottomans. So they lopped off 78% of Palestine here and set it up as an Arab state, put the Hashemites from Arabia over this area, and it was called Transjordan. A part of the charter was that in Transjordan, there were to be no Jews allowed. It's what the Nazi would call Judenrein, or Jew-free territory. This was for the Arabs. Well, then you would think that means the rest of Palestine would have been for the Jews. But the problem is that in the rest of Palestine, there were both Jews and Jews and Muslims, Arabs living there. And it became bloody. It was quite hard. The Arabs were led by the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini, who was a Nazi supporter who had supported the Nazi extermination of the Jewish people. We talked about him in the last lecture. He was leading the Arabs against the Jews. It was quite violent. And so it was very, very difficult. The British were really struggling with it. And then there were forces within the British. And Dr. Swales is going to tell you more about this next week, that within the British, there were those that didn't like the Jews anyway. And they just didn't want to help the Jews to set up sovereignty here. So in 1939, the British issued what was called the British White Paper. And this is where they completely turned against the Jewish people and betrayed the promises that they had made to them, that they were going to help them establish a homeland in Palestine. And this white paper limited Jewish immigration into the land, but it did not limit Arab immigration into the land. And this is an important point because I told you how that Mark Twain, when he traveled through the area in the 1800s, he said, Palestine sits in sackcloth and ashes. It is a barren, desolate land, and its greatest need is that of a population. It was empty. But when the Jews began making their way back to their homeland and reestablishing sovereignty, and I should say just moving there, and they were setting up communities, that created jobs. It created industry. And so the Arabs began moving into the area and taking the jobs. And it seems that the two populations grew at about the same rate. So, but here the British come along and they limit the Jewish immigration, but they don't limit the Arab immigration. So they really betrayed the Jewish people. But the real culmination of this betrayal came in 1947 when there was a ship of Jewish refugees coming from Europe. They were Holocaust survivors. They were refugees. And they landed in the port of Haifa anyway, even though they weren't being allowed to immigrate. They were refugees. They needed a place to go. They wanted to go to Palestine. So they are there in the port of Haifa, and the British fire on the ship. And because there was a Christian Methodist minister on board the ship to witness this, they snuck him to Jerusalem, where he witnessed to the UN Committee on Palestine, and he told them what the British had done. He told them the situation, that the Jewish people needed a place of refuge. They needed to be able to get into their ancient homeland. And this really influenced the United Nations, so that then they passed what's called the UN Partition Plan in November of that year. And that is where they took that remaining area of Palestine where there were Jews and Christians, and they lopped off these orange areas and said, these are for an Arab state, and these bluish, whitish areas, this is for a Jewish state. And I want you to notice that the city of Jerusalem here was not to be given to either the Jews or the Arabs. It was to be an international city, I guess, under UN rule. Well, the Jews didn't really like this plan because they wanted to have access to Jerusalem. You understand, Jerusalem is the #1 holy site for all of the Jewish people around the world. They wouldn't even have access to it. And secondly, the Arab world outright rejected the plan altogether. But there were a couple of ramifications here. So Israel was able to declare statehood then in 1948, just 6 months later, after the UN said we designate these areas. It paved the way politically for the state of Israel to be declared. But the Arabs, instead of declaring an Arab state in those territories, all they did was declare war on Jerusalem, on the Jewish state. But there's one other ramification of all of this that I just want to point out to you, because if you believe the Bible is true, if you believe Genesis 12:1-3 is true, that God will bless those that bless the descendants of Abraham, and he will curse them that curse them, and if you believe that Israel is a fulfillment of God's promises, that this is the second return that the scriptures predicted, if you do believe all of that, then you won't be surprised by this. But this is the beginning of the end of the great British Empire. The British Empire was, at its height, the largest empire in history, not just in the world, but in history. And for over a century, it was the foremost global power. It was said that the sun never set on the British Empire being here in these dark areas. In 1920, it covered 24% of the Earth's total land area. That's how big the British Empire was. However, between 1945 and 1965, the empire completely disintegrated. And the number of people that it ruled went from about 700 million back in 1945 to 5 million in 1965. And 3 million of those were in Hong Kong, and they later lost Hong Kong. So it was actually the transfer of Hong Kong in 1997 back to China that is marked by historians as the end of the British Empire. Today, Great Britain is just a state, a nation, like many, many, many other nations. This was the end of the Great British Empire. I personally believe it's because they betrayed the Jewish people. They tried to block them from entering the land. They actually fired upon them. They played very, very, very dirty with the Jewish people. And but that's my opinion. It's up to you to decide what you want to believe. So now we have Jewish statehood has been declared in 1948. Immediately, they are attacked by 5 Arab armies. Well, who are those Arab armies? Let me move my picture over there. We have Egypt, we have Jordan, we have Syria, we have Lebanon, and we have Iraq, which is off of this map. They immediately attack the little Jewish state, which is supposed to be here in this area. And in the fighting, Israel took more territory, so they actually made a path up to Jerusalem and took part of the city of Jerusalem. But the Jordanians had come from Jordan, and they occupied all of this land that was supposed to be for an Arab state, and they ended up with all of historic Jerusalem. The Jews only had it up to a certain point here. Now, this is a picture of Jerusalem during this time where Jordan had all the way up to here. And so that means Jordan had the old city of Jerusalem, which is biblical Jerusalem, and the ancient city of David, which was out of this area. This is all biblical Jerusalem, New Testament era, Old Testament era, time of Jesus, all of it. This is Jerusalem. The Jordanians had it. And Israel only made it up to this point. So then Israel, over the next 40, 50 years now, built up all of West Jerusalem. So today you'll hear the terminology East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem. This is where it comes from. During this time now, in 1947 to 1967, is immigration and nation building. So the number of Arabs in the Jewish areas dropped because about 600, 700,000 of them fled into the neighboring Arab countries. That's very controversial. They say that Israel drove them out, but actually it's been proven that many of them fled because the Arab leaders were telling them to get out, that they were going to come in with their armies, they were going to destroy the Jews, there'd be blood in the streets, and then these Arabs could come back to their homes. Of course, what happened is the Arabs didn't do that. They didn't move in. Israel won the war, and then these Arabs were in enemy territory. They couldn't get back across the border to their homes. Secondly, we think that some just, fled for safety. But yes, some had to flee because of the fighting. Their homes were then taken over. This is really a very controversial issue in the Arab-Israeli conflict, is the Palestinian refugees. But what you have to understand is at the same time, about 800,000 Jews had to flee their homes in Arab and Muslim lands throughout the area. They come to Israel. And this is when Israel focuses on absorbing all of these Jewish refugees, making them Israeli citizens. They're no longer refugees, and building a nation out of nothing, out of the dust of the desert and out of the ashes of the Holocaust. But what happened in 1967 is another major war. So here we have in this map in the light colors, this is the state of Israel in 1967. They have up to part of Jerusalem, but all of this is Jordanian territory. This is all Egyptian territory here. And there were events that led up to the Six-Day War. Israel could tell that there were forces amassing on their borders. They could tell that they were about to be attacked again, that war was coming. They sent word to Jordan and they said, you know, do not enter the war. We're not going to fight you. You do not have to be a part of this. And then Israel did a preemptive strike on Egypt in order to, you know, move the war into their advantage from the very beginning. And so they launched this attack against Egypt, and in just a matter of minutes, they had wiped out the entire Egyptian Air Force. And then they were attacked by Jordan. You see these arrows coming in. They were attacked by Syrian forces. It was later revealed that the Soviet Union planned to also attack Israel, but when they saw the stunning destruction of the Egyptian Air Force, they backed down, and then at the last minute, they actually did not attack. The Six-Day War is known as a major victory for Israel. At the end of the war, you'll see all of these territories that Israel now controlled, all of the Sinai Desert, the Gaza Strip. They had the West Bank. They had the Golan Heights from Syria. It was a stunning victory. This is a picture of reunited Jerusalem. The Jews are now today able to go to the western wall of the Temple Mount, their most holy site, and pray. But for those 19 years between 1949 and 1967, they could not even come here to the wall. This is their most holy site. And then this takes us just, 7 years later, there's another major war. And this is when on the Jewish high holy day of Yom Kippur, which is a day of fasting for the Jewish people, they spend the day in synagogue, they don't eat, they don't drive, they don't turn on radios, they don't turn on TV. This is their high holy day of the whole year. So these Arab armies took advantage of the situation. And on that holy day, they attacked Israel again. Now, this time, the war doesn't go so well. And it is looking really, really bad. It is said that in the middle of the 3-week war that it looked like Israel was losing. And so the prime minister, which at the time was Golda Meir, she was considering suicide. And she called up President Nixon in the middle of the night, and she said, if you don't do something, it's all over. And President Nixon defied his entire cabinet and his Secretary of State. He ordered that they send over hardware. And so as soon as those planes of hardware began to be unloaded, the Arabs knew that they were going to lose again. And once again, the Soviet Union backed down. Now, this was not quite as stunning of a victory, but it was a victory. It was a little humbling for Israel because it was really very close. But in the end, it was a victory. And because of the show of strength now, where Israel has had these two major victories when all the odds were against them, it's no coincidence that just a few years later, Sadat, the president of Egypt, says, okay, we can't defeat them. We're going to make peace with them. And so in 1978, Egypt had a peace agreement with Israel. And it was a real, true historic moment. And I can tell you, my first trip to Israel was in 1978. And then I returned in 1980 for my studies. And the Israeli people were just euphoric. I mean, many of them wept at this moment. They didn't think it would ever happen. They loved Sadat. They loved his strength and his courage, and that he would do this. He was a very, very special man. Unfortunately, he was murdered soon after this by his own people in retaliation. But the peace process, the peace accord with Egypt is still in place today. And as a result of this peace agreement, Israel gave back the entire Sinai desert here. So this pink area, Israel gave back to Egypt. And then these became the borders of Israel. Notice that Egypt did not want Gaza back. So Israel kept Gaza, and it was a part of Israel. Now, in 1987, we began another, I'd say, era in Israel's history. And what happened in 1987 is that the Palestinians in the West Bank area began to riot against Israel. And I need to tell you something I forgot to mention, is that not only were the Palestinians given the opportunity by the UN in 1947 to create a state just like they gave the Jews, the same opportunity, but they didn't do it. The Arabs never created a state. And then when Sadat made peace with Israel, he invited the Palestinians to come be a part of the agreement and to get their own agreement with Israel along with Egypt, and they refused to do it. So in 1987 here, these first riots, it's beginning to get quite hot. And until then, it had been very peaceful. I can tell you, in 1978, the early 80s, we used to travel through what's called the West Bank area. It was seamless with Israel. It was peaceful. It was safe. But in 1987, it just began to heat up, and this opposition began in these riots. So Israel began to look for how to make peace with the Palestinians. They had peace with Egypt. How can they make peace with the Palestinians? So they had several international peace conferences. It started with the Madrid Peace Conference, and then that led to the Oslo peace process. And there's been many, many meetings and agreements since then of trying to carve out peace with the Palestinians. And this was where it began. Now, while the Palestinians refused to negotiate peace with Israel, the Jordanians did. And this is a picture here of King Hussein of Jordan with the United States President Bill Clinton. And this is the Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, signing the peace accord with Jordan, which was actually a very warm peace. And it was much warmer than the peace that was now in place with Egypt after Sadat was murdered. This was a very warm peace with Jordan, but the Palestinians remained a problem. So in 2000, you may have heard of the Camp David Peace Summit. Yasser Arafat comes to America to Camp David. He and the Prime Minister of Israel meet with Bill Clinton. They're trying to hash out peace. Arafat ends up saying no. He leaves and he starts the second Intifada. This is in 2000. This Intifada was very, very bloody because it was a wave of suicide bombers coming out of the West Bank into Israel proper, into downtown Jerusalem, getting on city buses and blowing them up. And this is the picture of one of those buses. Now, it was a terrible time. The Israeli people were totally traumatized and terrorized, and many innocent civilians were being killed by these suicide bombers. So the Prime Minister for Israel at the time built what's known as the security fence or a security wall. Once again, there's a lot of misinformation about this. It's very highly controversial over what it really should be. This fence, most of it is here, it's like a metal fence. But in areas where there's houses nearby or it's a city where there might be snipers, it's actually a concrete wall. But this is only in a small portion of it. The rest of it is like this, a metal fence. And this fence and the security that Israel was able to provide with it stopped all of the suicide bombers. The bombers now had to go through checkpoints. They were caught before they got into Israel proper. This is accused of being an apartheid wall. It's a complete lie. There's nothing about race on this wall. It was about security and stopping the suicide bombers. Now, at the same, soon after this, in 2005, the Prime Minister of Israel, Ariel Sharon, decided that if the Palestinians were not going to negotiate peace, he was just going to withdraw from Gaza altogether. And he did. He withdrew from Gaza. He took all the troops out. He took all the civilians. There were 8,000 Israelis that lived in Gaza. They had homes, they had farms, they had greenhouses, they had businesses. This is a very, very beautiful piece of land here, right on the Mediterranean coast. He withdrew everybody. He set up his own border there. And he said, if you're not going to negotiate with us and draw up a joint border, we're just going to draw the border. And we did it. He moved out. And then, since then, from Gaza, we have Israel withdrew the troops in 2005. In 2007, the Palestinian government in Gaza fell to Hamas, who is a jihadist terrorist organization. They are actually the government in Gaza. Since 2007, they have fired some 20,000 rockets out of Gaza into Israel aimed at Israeli cities and civilians. We just had the most recent skirmish with Hamas this year in May. 4,000 rockets were fired out of Gaza into Israel. And thanks to Israeli technology and innovation, they created a missile defense system that is called the Iron Dome missile defense system. This Iron Dome system has saved millions of lives and billions of dollars, I might say. And here's a picture of one. So it's an installation that has radar inside of it. And as soon as a missile is fired out of Gaza, it's picked up on this radar and it's calculated exactly where is that rocket going to fall. And if it's going to fall in an open field, they let it fall. If it's going to go near a populated area, then the Iron Dome fires its own missile that goes up and finds that Hamas missile in the air and destroys it. And this has saved millions of lives, both of Israelis and of Arabs. 20% of the Israeli population are Arabs. We're going to get into that later. It has saved Palestinian lives, and it has saved billions and billions of dollars because there's no damage to infrastructure. And that means that Israel is not forced to move in with ground troops and full military offensive into Gaza until it just has to. As long as it can keep its civilian population safe through this Iron Dome system, then they don't have to move into Gaza. Now, this is in brief the history of Israel. Its founding war, the 67 war, the 73 war, its quest for peace, the current situation with Hamas, and in spite of this is the current situation in with the Palestinians in the West Bank area. So the Palestinian leaders have missed every opportunity given to them since 1947 to create statehood. They instead refuse to recognize the existence of Israel and to negotiate with Israel. So in other words, if you're going to negotiate with someone and set a border, that implies that you have recognized they exist and you're going to allow them to exist on that territory while you create this border with them. And that's why the Palestinian leaders will not negotiate with Israel, because it is an acquiescence. It's a recognition of their existence. So Israel actually provides the security that's keeping the Palestinian government in place in the West Bank, because Hamas, which is far more radical, is trying to take over the West Bank. So it's in Israel's best interest to keep the Palestinian Authority in government, even though the Palestinian Authority won't work with them and won't recognize them. So this is how complicated the situation is. But in spite of all of this, the Arab world has now given up on the Palestinians and is making peace with Israel themselves. And this is what's astounding. And you're going to hear more about this next week from Dr. Swells. While Israel is going through all of these wars, all of this political turmoil, all of this opposition to her very existence, she has built a thriving modern nation state that is beginning to actually lead the world in innovation. They are leading in so many areas of science and technology and medicine, computers, cell phones, agriculture, weapons systems, telecommunications, high tech, biotech, nanotech, all these areas. It is absolutely astounding what they have been able to do in a nation that is only 73, almost 75 years old, founded on the sands of the desert, out of the ashes of the Holocaust, with nothing. And they have built this kind of a nation. They've not just survived, they have thrived. And this really is the miracle of the second return of the Jewish people to their homeland. Next week, you're going to hear from Dr. Swells. He is going to dig just a little bit deeper in certain aspects of what I've shared with you this week, but I wanted you to have the overview. You'll understand far greater this way some of what he's going to be talking about next week. And I hope that you will now understand your reading assignment this week and next week, and I'll see you back in a couple of weeks from now. Thank you so much.